By the time the applause faded, something already felt off. Not visibly, not dramatically. On the surface, everything looked like success: polished smiles, confident handshakes, envelopes exchanged under warm office lighting. Numbers were spoken out loud, bonuses celebrated, a ritual everyone understood, until one number didn't fit: $4,000. It didn't echo like the others. It landed quietly, almost politely, and yet somehow it stayed in the air longer than anything else said that evening. She didn't react, not immediately. Just a pause. A nod. The kind of composure that makes people uncomfortable without them knowing why. Because somewhere between "be grateful" and silence, something shifted, not in the room, in the system. And systems, unlike people, don't forget. Especially when Section 9 is involved. The room was still carrying the momentum of celebration. Glass walls reflected soft amber light. Someone laughed too loudly near the corner table. Finance shook hands with operations as if numbers themselves had just closed a deal. It was that familiar corporate atmosphere, where success is measured, distributed, and briefly performed, and at the center of it all stood the board. Confident, structured, certain. The CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority in rooms like this doesn't come from volume. It comes from expectation. Everyone gets $14,000. A pause, calculated, almost ceremonial. You get $4,000. Be grateful. No explanation followed. None was expected. Because in that system, explanation had never been part of the process. Only outcome, only hierarchy, only acceptance. She stood exactly where she had been standing moments before. No shift in posture, no visible reaction, no correction, no protest, no confusion. Just stillness. The kind that doesn't resist, but doesn't agree either. And that subtle difference, it rarely goes unnoticed by people who are used to being obeyed. A few glances moved across the room. Quick, quiet, instinctive. Not because something had happened, but because something hadn't. No gratitude, no smile, no performance, just acknowledgement. And then, thank you. Polite, clean, neutral, too neutral. If you understood the architecture of corporate dynamics, you would recognize that moment instantly. It wasn't about the money, it was about deviation. Because systems like this depend on predictability, on expected emotional responses that confirm the hierarchy is still intact. Gratitude confirms order. Silence questions it. And she had chosen silence wrapped in courtesy, which in many ways is far more destabilizing. Across the room, someone from HR leaned slightly toward another colleague, a whisper, barely audible. Pay gap? The word moved like a draft under a closed door, not strong enough to be acknowledged, but enough to be felt. Because numbers, once spoken, don't disappear. They settle, they compare, they align themselves against memory. And in that quiet recalibration, narratives begin to shift. The CEO had already moved on. Another handshake, another congratulation, another controlled display of leadership continuity. But something small had slipped past the script, not visibly, not measurably, but structurally. She placed the envelope on the table beside her, didn't open it, didn't look inside, which, in a room built entirely around numbers, was almost an act of defiance, and yet it was delivered without friction, without confrontation, without a single word out of place. That's the part most people miss. Control in corporate systems isn't lost through loud conflict, it erodes through quiet misalignment, through moments where expected behavior simply doesn't occur, and the system doesn't know how to categorize it. Near the exit, she paused. Not long. Just enough to acknowledge someone who met her eyes. A brief nod. Professional, respectful, final. Then she walked out. No scene, no statement, no signal. At least, none that the room was trained to detect. Behind her, the celebration resumed, because that's what systems do best. They normalize, they continue, They assume continuity until something forces them to reconsider. But somewhere else in the building, in layers far below conversation and far above emotion, a dependency still existed. A signature, a control point embedded quietly inside Section 9, and unlike applause, it didn't fade. It waited. By the time the room had fully returned to its rhythm, the imbalance was already recorded, not in people, in structure, and structures, once misaligned, don't correct themselves. They respond, just not always immediately. By the time the building emptied, the celebration had already rewritten itself into memory, not as conflict, not as imbalance, as routine. That's how corporate systems protect themselves. They compress discomfort into something manageable, something forgettable, something that fits. Emails were sent, bonuses logged, numbers entered into systems that never question context, only input. $14,000, $14,000, $14,000, $4,000, aligned, approved, processed. On paper, everything made sense. At 21:07, the finance floor was almost silent. Only a few screens remained lit, islands of cold blue light in an otherwise dark space. Cleaning staff moved quietly through the corridors, careful not to interrupt what little remained of the workday. And somewhere inside that silence, a process was waiting. Not broken, not failing, waiting. The system didn't react immediately. It never does. Because systems designed around control points don't panic, they verify, they trace dependencies, they confirm authority, and then they decide. At 21:12, the first alert appeared, not loud, not urgent, just a small notification on a secondary monitor. Authorization pending, Section 9 bonus control. No one noticed, because no one was looking for it. At 21:18, a second process stalled, then a third. Not errors, not failures. Pauses, like something had reached a boundary it couldn't cross. Downstairs, security logs continued as usual, badge scans, exit timestamps, routine movement recorded without interpretation. Her exit was just another line in the system, timestamped, archived, closed, except the system didn't treat it as closure. At 21:26, Finance tried to finalize the bonus allocation batch, a standard procedure, automated, predictable, until it wasn't. Execution delayed. A rare message, not alarming but unfamiliar, and unfamiliar in structured environments is always the first signal. Someone refreshed the screen, then again, same result, no error code, no explanation, just delay. By 21:31, the first human reaction appeared, a message in internal chat. Anyone else seeing a lag in bonus processing? Another reply, yeah, probably system load. Logical, comfortable, safe. Because the alternative required asking a different kind of question. At 21:36, the system escalated internally, not to people, to itself. It checked authority layers, validated permissions, traced control dependencies, and there it was, clear, documented, undeniable. Section 9, bonus control authorization, signature required, active, missing. That's the moment the architecture shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally, because in that system, control wasn't tied to position, it was tied to access, and access had just walked out of the building. At 21:42, the CFO's dashboard updated, a quiet flag in the corner of the screen. Pending authorization, critical. He didn't notice immediately, because nothing was failing. Yet. By 21:47, the delay had spread. Compensation reports froze mid-generation. Approval chains paused mid-route. Automated triggers queued without execution. The system wasn't collapsing. It was holding, waiting for something it had been explicitly designed to require. And this is where most organizations misunderstand their own infrastructure. They believe control lives in titles, in hierarchy, in who speaks the loudest in a room, but real control lives in the quiet places, in clauses like Section 9, in signatures no one thinks about until they disappear. At 21:52, someone finally asked the right question. Who has final authorization on Section 9? A pause in the chat, then a name appeared. Her name. No reaction followed immediately, because the implication needed time to settle, not emotionally, structurally. At 21:55, the CFO opened the system logs, scrolled once, then stopped. The room around him was silent, but now it felt different, not empty, heavy. He didn't say anything at first, didn't need to, because the data was already saying it, clearly, precisely, without emotion. Her signature is required. A short pause, then, quieter. And it's not there. Across the system, processes continued to wait, perfectly stable, perfectly aligned, perfectly blocked, not by failure, by design. And somewhere beyond the building, beyond the dashboards, beyond the controlled environment that had always assumed compliance, she was no longer part of the system, but the system was still built around her. Because what looked like a bonus decision earlier that evening was never just about compensation. It was about control. And now, for the first time, the system was revealing exactly where that control had always been. And the question no one wanted to ask out loud finally took shape. If the system doesn't move without her, what else won't? If you've ever been told to be grateful instead of being treated fairly, pause for a second, because what just happened here isn't fiction for most people. It's structure. It's how systems quietly test limits, expecting compliance in exchange for stability. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't loud, it's precise. At 22:03, the building no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a system that had paused mid-breath. Lights were still on in pockets. Screens still active, data still moving, but without resolution, like sentences that refused to end, because nothing could conclude without Section 9. The CFO didn't call anyone immediately. He understood something others didn't yet. This wasn't an error, it was alignment. The system was doing exactly what it had been instructed to do, just not what the room expected. And that distinction? Expensive. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the logs. Every process told the same story. Authorization required, authorization missing, authorization hers. There was no workaround written into the architecture, no bypass, no emergency override, which meant one thing. At some point, someone had trusted this control point completely, and then forgotten it existed. At 22:07, the first escalation request was drafted, not sent. Drafted, because wording in moments like this matters more than speed. Temporary authorization reassignment required. It sounded technical, neutral, safe. It avoided the real sentence. We no longer control our own system. Across the floor, another message appeared in internal chat. Is this linked to earlier? No one clarified what earlier meant. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room had already connected the two events, the bonus, the silence, the exit. At 22:11, IT joined the thread. System integrity is intact, no failure detected. That line changed everything, because now it was confirmed. Nothing was broken, nothing to fix, only something to understand. And understanding, in systems like this, is where discomfort begins. Because it forces recognition of dependencies, of decisions, of assumptions that were never tested, until now. The CEO hadn't been informed yet, not directly. Information was moving upward carefully, filtered through layers that still hoped for a simpler explanation, a glitch, a delay, a temporary misalignment, anything but structural exposure. At 22:16, the CFO finally spoke, not loudly. Not urgently, just clearly. Check the authorization chain history. Someone pulled it up, scrolled, stopped. There it was. A clean sequence of approvals over time, each one reinforcing the same structure, each one confirming the same dependency, each one signed by her. No redundancy, no secondary authority, no shared control, just a single point of validation, quietly embedded, consistently used, never questioned. Until now. This is the paradox most organizations create for themselves. They optimize for efficiency, centralize control, reduce friction, and in doing so, they build systems that work perfectly, right up until the moment they don't. At 22:21, the realization fully landed, not as panic, as clarity, the kind that removes all alternative explanations at once. Someone asked, "Can we reassign it?" A pause. Then Ait replied, "Not without existing authorization." Another pause, longer, heavier, because now the loop had closed, the system required her to replace her. The CFO exhaled slowly, not frustration, recognition, because this wasn't a technical problem anymore, it was a positional one. At 22:24, the CEO was finally notified, a short message, carefully constructed. Bonus processing delayed due to Section 9 authorization dependency. Delivered without emotion, but carrying all of it. Across the building, nothing visibly changed. No alarms, no shutdown, no collapse, just a system that refused to move forward without a piece it no longer had. And that's when the deeper question surfaced, not about the system, about the decision. Because earlier that evening, in a room full of certainty, a number had been assigned, a message had been delivered, a hierarchy had been reinforced. But what no one accounted for was that hierarchy doesn't always align with architecture, and when the two conflict, architecture wins. Every time. At 22:29, the CFO closed the log window, slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging something final. "Find her," he said. No urgency, no panic, just instruction, because now it was no longer about bonuses, or optics, or internal narratives. It was about restoring control. And somewhere outside that building, in a space completely disconnected from dashboards, approvals, and carefully structured authority, she was no longer responding to the system. The system was about to start responding to her absence. At 22:41, the word delay was no longer used, not in finance, not in IT, not in the quiet, controlled tone of internal messages that had been trying, carefully, to minimize what was happening. Because by now, it wasn't a delay, it was dependency. The CEO read the message twice, then a third time, not because it was unclear, because it was too clear. Section 9 authorization dependency. A sterile phrase, clean, technical. But behind it sat a very specific reality. The system had stopped. By design. He didn't ask what Section 9 was. He already knew. Or rather, he remembered. Vaguely. Distantly. Like a clause reviewed months ago, approved without friction, archived without consequence. Until now. Call IT. The instruction was immediate, measured, controlled, because authority, when challenged, instinctively moves to reassert itself. At 22:44, the call connected. Short explanations, precise language, no speculation. System operational. Processes paused at authorization layer. Final control assigned under Section 9. A pause, then the CEO asked the only question that mattered. Override? Silence on the line, not long, but long enough. No override without existing authorization. That was the moment the structure inverted, not visibly, but definitively, because in that answer, hierarchy had just encountered a boundary it didn't control. In the glass reflection of the office, his posture didn't change, but something else did. Expectation. Because systems like this are built on an assumption. That authority flows downward. That decisions translate directly into outcomes. That control is absolute. Until it isn't. At 22:48, another instruction. Reassign authorization. IT didn't answer immediately. They checked, confirmed, verified. And then, with the same calm precision, Reassignment requires current holder approval. The room didn't react, not externally, but internally, something tightened, because now it wasn't about fixing a process, it was about a loop, closed, self-reinforcing, unbreakable from the inside. At 22:52, the CFO entered. No urgency, no raised voice, just presence, the kind that signals alignment between departments that don't usually need to align this quickly. He didn't explain, didn't summarize, just placed a tablet on the desk and turned it slightly. The logs were still open, still unchanged, still waiting. Her signature is in Section 9 bonus control. He didn't repeat it, didn't need to, because now it wasn't information, it was context. The CEO looked at the screen, then away, then back again, as if expecting something to update on its own. It didn't. Across the system, queues were building, not failing, accumulating, every process reaching the same point, and stopping, every path leading to the same absence. This is where corporate perception begins to fracture, because up until this moment, everything had been manageable, contained, interpretable. Now it wasn't, because the system wasn't misbehaving, it was enforcing. At 22:56, the first external risk appeared, not financial, not yet. Reputational, because bonus distribution timelines weren't just internal metrics, they were signals, promises, expectations tied to performance cycles, investor reports, internal trust. And trust, once delayed, doesn't degrade slowly, it shifts. Timeline? The CEO asked. No one answered immediately, because any estimate required an assumption that control would be restored, and right now, that assumption wasn't guaranteed. The CFO spoke instead, quietly. Until authorization is resolved, nothing moves. Simple, final, uncomfortable. The CEO stood, walked to the window. The city outside was still active, lights, motion, continuity, everything functioning exactly as expected. Inside, the system remained perfectly stable, perfectly aligned, perfectly paused. This is the moment most leaders misunderstand. They think disruption looks like chaos, like alarms, like visible failure. But real disruption looks like silence, like systems that continue running, but stop delivering. At 23:02, the instruction came again, shorter this time, more direct. Find her. Not as a suggestion, as a necessity. Because now, the equation had changed. It wasn't about compensation anymore, or optics, or internal messaging. It was about control architecture. And the architecture had just revealed something critical. The system didn't belong to the hierarchy. It belonged to whoever held the key. And at that moment, she did. At 23:14, the building reached a state it had never been designed to handle. Not failure, not crisis, absence. Everything was still running, servers active, dashboards live, data synchronized across every layer of the organization. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, nothing could move forward. That's the quiet paradox of controlled systems. They don't collapse when something is missing. They wait. At 23:17, the first call went unanswered, not escalated, not repeated immediately, just noted. Because at this level, persistence is calculated, not reactive. Try again in 5. Across the finance floor, screens remained open on the same frozen checkpoints. Authorization pending, authorization required, authorization absent. The repetition was becoming psychological, not technical, because when a system repeats the same condition without variation, it stops being information. It becomes pressure. At 23:22, a second call. Same result. No response. Someone suggested email, another suggested internal messaging, a third checked access logs again, as if the system might suddenly reinterpret reality. It didn't. At 23:25, the CFO stopped looking at the screen, because there was nothing left to extract from it. The system had already said everything it needed to say, clearly, repeatedly, without emotion. He turned slightly. Prepare impact summary. Not fix it, not resolve. Summarize. That single shift in language revealed the real state of the situation, because you summarize when something is already happening, not when you still believe you can prevent it. At 23:29, the first outline appeared. Bonus distribution delayed. Approval chain blocked at Section 9. No override mechanism. Dependency. Single authorization holder. Clean, structured, unavoidable. The CEO read it once, then again, slower. Not searching for errors, searching for options. There weren't many. Can we isolate it? He asked. It responded carefully. We can isolate the process, but not execute it. Another boundary, another confirmation. The system wasn't resisting, it was enforcing. At 23:34, something subtle changed in the room. Not urgency, clarity. Because up until now, there had been a quiet hope that this was temporary, that resolution was a matter of time. Now it was evident. Resolution was a matter of access, and access wasn't in the room. The CFO spoke again, not to the CEO, to the situation itself. She understood the architecture. No one disagreed, because the logs had already proven it. Every approval chain, every authorization layer, every dependency point, all aligned around one design decision, centralized control under Section 9, efficient, precise, unquestioned, until it became absolute. At 23:38, the third call was placed. This time, no one spoke while it rang, because now it wasn't about reaching her. It was about what it meant if they didn't. Voicemail. No message left. That silence landed differently, not like absence, like confirmation. Across the system, queues continued to build, not exponentially, predictably, linearly, controlled, which made it worse, because chaos can be explained, stability without progress cannot. At 23:42, the CEO finally turned away from the window. Options. A single word. The CFO answered without hesitation. 2. A pause. We restore authorization. Another pause. Or we accept delay. He didn't say the third option. He didn't need to. Because by now, it was already understood. Restoring authorization meant one thing: re-engaging the person who had been dismissed without consideration. And accepting delay meant something else: allowing the system to publicly demonstrate where control actually resided. Neither option was comfortable. At 23:47, the building was silent again, not the early silence of routine, the later silence of realization. Because this was no longer about a mistake, it was about exposure. Exposure of a gap, not in pay, in understanding. The assumption had been simple: that value is defined by role, that control is defined by title, that systems follow hierarchy. And now, all three had been quietly disproven. At 23:51, the CFO closed the summary, not because it was complete, because it was enough. He looked at the CEO. We mispriced control. No accusation, no emotion, just precision. Because that's what this had always been. Not a conflict, not a reaction, a correction. And somewhere beyond the reach of internal systems, dashboards, and structured authority, she existed outside the architecture, unaffected, unreachable, while the system she once operated within continued to wait for her, not as an employee, as a requirement. And for the first time, the organization understood the difference. Silence didn't fill the room. It defined it.